Okay, so the topic here is best supporting actors, and what I want to spend time with tonight and over the next couple of sessions together is focusing on trying to get a better understanding of some of these other characters in the Megillah itself. We're very familiar with characters like Esther and Mordechai and Haman and Achashverosh, and they play a predominant and important role. But if you ever watch any movie that's worth anything, you'll know that sometimes it's the supporting characters that make the biggest difference and can really take the story and move it from being just a good and interesting story to really making it great. And more than that, it's sometimes the supporting actors that help us best understand the roles that the main players, the main actors themselves are participating in. And so that's what tonight's class is about. I want to start with Vashti. Now, what's fascinating about Vashti is that there are a bunch of people who are mentioned before her in the Megillah, 6 other people. And if you look on our source sheet, the entirety of Vashti's story can be summarized really just in these psukim, just in these verses from the first and second parak of the Megillah. And it's all here on the first page. So just on a high level, I think some of us already know the story of the Megillah. We're going to read through these psukim together, but on a high level, let's just throw out what are some problems or questions that we might need to solve about Vashti and the story that she has with Achashverosh. This would be the time to unmute yourself and participate. Don't all go at once, please. Okay, maybe we'll just have to read through it painstakingly, the whole Megillah maybe. Let's look at the Megillah. Vayhi b'Achashverosh. Hu Achashverosh hamalech nodu v'akush sheva v'esrim u'miyah medina. 127 provinces. Did a man by the name of Achashverosh rule. And then by Yamim Ahim, kishev Ramelch Achashverosh al kiseh malchuto asher b'shan habirah. It happened that when he was sitting in his throne at this time, Bishnat Shlosh L'Malcho was the 3rd year of his ruling. Asa Mishtei decided to throw a big party, L'chol Sarav Avadav, for all of his officers, all of his servants, Chel Paras Madaya Partim, V'Sarei Hamninot Lefanav, all the different officers, everybody came, and in fact he throws 2 different parties, but we cut that out for the sake of time. Now enters our supporting character Vashti, Pasuk Tet, verse 9. Gam Vashti Malka Asta Mishtei Nashim. It wasn't enough that Achashverosh makes a big party, she also is going to make a party as well. And I want you, as we're reading through these verses and these psukim, even if you're familiar with the story very well, I challenge you to actually to look really carefully at what the text says. It's so easy when it comes to the Megillah for us to remember stories that maybe we heard in day school or Hebrew school or from shul or from books, but oftentimes those stories will not match what's written right here in the actual text itself. And so as we read through it, see if anything jumps out to you as maybe something different than what you'd expect, or things that don't maybe make a lot of sense. So she also throws a big party, Beit HaMalchut Achashverosh, in the Beit HaMalchut that was for Achashverosh. Bayom HaShvi'i, on the 7th day, Ketov Lev HaMelch B'yayin, let's just say he had a little bit much to drink after 7 days of partying. Amar LeMehuman, he turns to Mehuman, Vista Chavona B'Tav Av Geta Zeta V'Chakas, Shivat HaSarisim HaMeshartim Mepnei HaMelech Achashverosh. He turns to 7 of his supporters. Now, what's interesting is that many suggest here that who is this Mehuman in Pasuk Yud? Who might he be? Who does Mehuman sound like in verse 10?
Haman.
Yeah, correct. So the Gemara Megillah says that what was he? Why is he Mehuman? Because he is like Memuchan, that he's ready for Puraniot. He's prepared to do bad things. And so some suggest that who is this character that he should be introduced first? So this is really Haman before he's kind of raised to power. And so we already start to see that he's starting to do some things. However, when we read the psukim, it doesn't seem that way as well. Who else, by the way, makes the guest appearance in this list? Like we're going to talk about in 2 weeks. Who else makes a guest appearance? Our friend Charvona. Remember, Charvona, most of us only think about Charvona at the end of the story, but it's interesting that Charvona also makes an appearance at the very, very beginning of the story, which I think in itself is something that needs to be dissected. But who are these people? Who are these people? Some suggest that these people are more than just like officers or supporters or advisors, but they were actually all eunuchs as well, which is just interesting that these are the people that he turns to. So he turns to them, and what does he do? He turns to them and says, to bring Vashti beketer malchut. What does that mean, keter malchut? Wearing the keter, wearing the crown. She should come. And the Midrash teaches us based on this, that what does it mean that she was wearing the crown? Meaning just the crown, nothing else. She should come in the nude, and all she should do is wear the crown itself. Why? To show her beauty to everybody else. So let's just pause here for a moment. What stands out as like a strange thing between these two psukim, pasuk yud and pasuk yud aleph? If the king wants to do something, what does the king do? He makes a decree. Does the king make a decree here?
No.
There's no decree. What does he do? Instead, he turns to some of his advisors and says, hey, do me a favor. Can you go find my wife for me? So this is a strange thing. Is he not on talking terms with his wife? Why does he involve these advisors in this situation? More than that, what is the relationship between the advisors and Achashverosh relative to Vashti? And then why does he suddenly invite her to show her beauty? What is going on here that's so significant that she wants to suddenly, out of left field, show her beauty to everybody else? It's a very strange thing. Let's keep going. She hears the message from the Sarisim, and she says, no, I'm not going to come. And you can imagine that did not sit well with King Achashverosh. He was quite angry. He says, let it be known. So Shivat Sarai Parasim Adai, these are his the Mumuchan. This is again perhaps a reference to Haman over here. So these are the people, right? These are all people close to him. He asked them, what should I do with my queen? Vashti, what do I do with her? So enters Mumuchan and says, what does Mumuchan say suddenly? He says, listen, she's committed such a serious offense. Look in verse 16, such a serious offense against your majesty, but also against all the officials, against all the people. How could this be such a serious offense that she just didn't want to come and embarrass herself? What's going to happen? Women are going to get into their head. They're going to think that it's an appropriate thing to do to embarrass their husbands and to refuse them. So this is a reason that we need to take action. They'll see what happened. They'll see what happened to you, O great king. And they're going to think to themselves, wait a second, the women are going to revolt everywhere. The whole system is going to come crumbling down, he says. Again, everyone will find out. What does he suggest in verse 19 in Pasuk Yotet? That we should take it and give it to someone else who's more worthy. What does that pasuk remind anybody of anything, pasuk Yotet? If you flip your page for a moment, it's really fascinating. If you turn to Shmuel Aleph, the story of Shmuel and King Shaul. Shaul HaMelech was given a very specific command to do what? To kill all of Amalek, and he doesn't do it. Well, he kills the people, but he leaves the animals. God says that he should have killed the animals. Meanwhile, you've got all these animals who are like huffing and puffing because, as the legend goes, they were actually like shape-shifting human beings. And Shmuel said you need to kill everyone. In addition, he kept Agag, the king, alive as well. But notice the language here in this pasuk in chapter 15, pasuk Kavchet. Vayomer lav Shmuel kara Hashem mamachut Yisrael me'alecha hayom. Today, Shmuel says to Shaul, God is going to tear away your kingdom. And what happens moments before this is that as Shmuel walks away, Shaul grabs his cloak and it tears. And so in response to the terror, so he comes to him and says, the same way you tore my cloak, God's going to tear away the kingship from you. And who's it going to go to? Unitana l're'acha hatov mimecha. It's going to go to your re'acha. It's going to go to your friend who is more worthy. Hatov mimcha. Look at the language in Pasuk Yatet in verse 19. What does it say here? Who is the malchut going to go to from Vashti? Lir uta hatova mimena. I just think that's like an interesting parallel that's happening here between the story of Shmuel, and it's again, what part of the story of Shmuel and Shaul? It's the moment when he doesn't kill Amalek. And who do we know that Haman is a grandson of? Amalek. So it's just a fascinating comparison here that the very same Memuchan, who again, who is Memuchan Leporaniot, as the Gemara says, is perhaps using the same language that Shmuel uses to Shaul for not have killing what could have possibly been Haman's grandparents or great-grandparents. Just a fascinating turn of phrase that I don't think is chance at all. I think this is the Megillah being very explicit in trying to use its language to teach us something. So anyways, word gets out. Vaytav hadavar pasuk kaf aleph hadavar b'nei hamelech v'asarim vayas hamelech kivar Memuchan. He does what Memuchan tells him. Vayshach sarim al kumdon hamelech. So he goes and sends all these books, these svarim, these like letters everywhere to let everyone know what happened. Most importantly, that everyone should know what's going on and that they should wield authority in their home and speak the language of their people. And then comes chapter 2. After all this takes place, when he calms down a bit, and he no longer is of a drunken state, Zachar Vashti, he remembers Vashi and everything that she had done, and that which he decreed about her. So pause. What happens to Vashti? Is she what happens to her? Does Vashti ever get killed?
It doesn't say it. It doesn't say she gets killed. It just says she disappears.
It doesn't even say she disappears. It just says that she just is not here anymore. What are some like textual clues, in particular in Perek Bet Pasuk Aleph, that might insinuate some things that might have happened to her? Notice how she's referred to in the Psukim here in Pasuk Aleph. What is when the text is describing her? Does the text call her as Hamalka, Vashti Hamalka?
No.
Just Vashti. So we know at the minimum she lost. Her kingship or queenship, whatever you might want to say. I saw a really, really crazy idea. I really don't subscribe to it, but I want to share with you in any case because I think it's like an interesting thing to think about, which is we don't know what happens to Vashti. And as we'll see, I think her character is pretty important to the overall narrative and overall story. It would be strange for us not to know what happens. Some suggest, there's this idea that I read about, which again doesn't resonate with me, but maybe it will with you, is that what happens to Vashti? So imagine Achashverosh's feeling. He feels, how would you describe his feelings in this pasuk? He's feeling a little bit of remorse. He's not so happy with what happened, but he can't walk it back. After all, what did Memuchan say? Look how all the women in the kingdom are going to act. Now, can you imagine if he walks it back? Even bigger problem. Women are going to think that they could like do things like vote or I don't know what. That was a joke, obviously. Okay.
Vote.
It was okay. Bad joke. So it's late over here, Thank you. I appreciate it. I thought it was funny. But in any case, so there's this notion that we don't know what happens to her, and some suggest that maybe she just goes back into the harem with everybody else, and she just lives her life, just no longer as queen. So this idea is that we are all of a sudden, out of left field, introduced to a character a little bit later named Esther. What do we know about Esther? Nothing. The only detail that we really know about Esther is that she does not have av va'im. She does not have parents. So this hypothesis is that maybe Vashti has a turn of heart of her own, and maybe she converts, and maybe she is the same woman from all along. Now, what is her relationship with Mordechai? I don't know. I think there's more holes in this hypothesis than not, but it's an interesting thought that when a person goes through a conversion process. So in a halachic sense, they are also in lo avaim. So they also, in a sense, don't have like halachic parentage. They're still like parents, but they don't have halachic parents. And so maybe Vashti is Esther, they're the same person. I don't know. It's something to think about, but not really beyond what I want to talk about today. So instead today, I want to focus on some basic questions. Like again, number one, why does Achashverosh take this domestic dispute, obviously between him and his partner? Why does he take this dispute and make it so public, right? Or why does he call in these confidants or these advisors into this conversation? Could he not have figured this out on his own? Or is, why is this the reaction? Because she doesn't want to come? Quite honestly, if you asked someone to come to see you, even if you are the king, unless you're such a wicked person to come, it's a pretty unreasonable request. So what does Achashverosh think is going to happen when he makes this request? Is he just so drunk they can't think clearly? And I think most importantly for this evening's discussion is, what about Vashti? How do we make sense of her actions and her refusal? Because if the king does ask you to do something, you really do need to do it. Is Vashti, can we learn anything about her righteousness or perhaps her wickedness from these psukim? And that's what I want to kind of explore over the next 20 minutes or so, half an hour or so. So I want to present maybe 3, maybe 4 different ways that we can look at Vashti, all which I think help us get a better understanding of the larger narrative. So to start, let's take a step back and try to understand who was Achashverosh. This is a matter of debate between Chazal, rabbinic literature, and actually like history. I'm not an expert in history. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in Midrash either. However, I'm more familiar with the Midrashim. But if you take a look, there are a few proof points. So for example, if you look in box number 3, let's try to see if we can pinpoint who Achashverosh was and when he lived. So one time, like one period of time that we see referenced in the Megillah comes in a few psukim later in Pasuk Hey and Pasuk Vav, when we're introduced to our very good friend Mordechai. He was living in Shushan. Ushmo Mordechai, his name was Mordechai, ben Yair, the son of Yair, ben Shimi, the son of Shimi, ben Kish, the son of Kish, Ishimini, who was from the tribe of Binyamin. Now, this is the tricky part. Asher Hagla Miushalayim, who had been exiled from Jerusalem, Im Hagola, Asher Haglata, Im Yachniah, Melch Yudah, Asher Hagla Nebuchadnezzar, Melch Bavel. He was at this person, Asher Hagla, it says Kish, but he had been exiled from Jerusalem, the group that was carried out during this time and driven out by Nebuchadnezzar. Who is the he? Is the he referring to Mordechai, or is the he referring potentially to someone else like Kish? Ever understand the question? Right? Asher Hagla Miushalayim. Who was the one who was exiled? So the rabbinic interpretation is that, well, the person we're talking about here is actually, it's Mordechai. Mordechai is Asher Hagla Miushalayim. And if that's the case, then that puts Achashverosh living at a time period between the destruction of the first and second temple. This is tricky because it's unclear about his son, or whether or not Darius is his son, or perhaps he may be even his father. So again, historically, it's hard to kind of square this circle, but at least from the rabbinic perspective, he was living in this time period between these two things that happened. And we see this throughout different sources. So if you look in source number 4, Rabbi Nechemiah Amar, when we say Bishnat Shalosh L'Malcho, when the Megillah tells us on the very beginning that it was the third year of his kingship that he makes in Pasuk Gimel, Bishnat Shalosh L'Malcho Asa Mishta, he made this big party. So what does this mean? So it was the third year, Lebitul Melecha Beit HaMikdash. It had been 3 years since the Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed. And Kevan Shegamar Lebitum Lecha Beit HaMikdash, since the Beit HaMikdash and all of the work that would happen in the Beit HaMikdash was stopped for 3 years, why did he make a party? Well, he made a party, the Medrash says, because the Beit HaMikdash was no longer able to be built. It had been 3 years. And there are other Midrashim, for example, that describe when they were partying in Yerushalayim, that what are they drinking from? They're drinking from the kelim themselves of the Beis Hamikdash. They're literally drinking from the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash. They're mocking the Jewish people. And some even go as far to suggest the Jewish people are there as well. The Jewish people are invited, the Amalekites are invited, everybody's invited to these parties, right? And the Jewish people are sitting there and they're rubbing shoulders and rubbing arms with the very people who destroyed their Beis Hamikdash and are celebrating the fact that the Beit HaMikdash is not, in fact, being rebuilt. So this is an example of how the Midrash is putting Achashverosh into this time period between the first and second destruction of the temple. And we see this in other places as well. For example, when Esther comes and Achashverosh offers her Chatzia Malchut, half of the kingdom, if you see in box number 5 in the Gemara Megillah, ask me anything, you can have up until half of the kingdom. What does it mean? Half of the kingdom? Why is that like it's a weird thing to say? So the Gemara says, I'll give you half the kingdom, but not all of the kingdom. And not only is it not going to be that, I'm not going to give you anything that could be a barrier to the kingdom. What could be something that could be a mechitza to the malchus? Mind you, what are we talking about? Binyan Beit HaMikdash. You can ask for anything. This is like an amazing question. Esther is standing in front of King Achashverosh. She could ask for anything. This was the very famous question that's asked of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai when he's offered to do anything he wants. And what does he say? He says, "Tanli Yavna v'chachamad." Give me Yavna and its sages. She is standing literally in front of the king, and the king is willing to grant any request that she wants. And Esther asks just to give permission for the Jewish people to fight back. She could have asked for the Beis Hamikdash, and yet she doesn't. And she doesn't perhaps because of this unique language, because Achashverosh perhaps was no dummy. Now that tells us a little bit about where Achashverosh was living and his background. This also helps us understand a few other pieces. One other insight about Achashverosh. If you take a look in the very first pasuk, anyone notice like strange language relative to how he would describe a king in verse number 1, going back to the previous page in pasuk Aleph? His name was Achashverosh Hamolech Mehodu Vadkush. What should it have said? And the Gemara talks about this. Rav says this. If you were to describe him, you would call him Achashverosh, right? You call him Bimei Achashverosh Melech, wherever he was the king of. In the same way, for example, in the Gemara says, Vayhi Bimei Amarfel Melech Shinar. He was the king of Shinar. When it uses the word Hamolech, it suggests that perhaps he was doing something. He was a usurper of power, and perhaps he usurps the power from Cyrus. Cyrus had given permission to rebuild the temple, and so he usurps it, and perhaps is the one who prevents the temple from being rebuilt. Now, let's try to understand, how does Vashi fit into this? So there's a very famous line that we read on fast days. It'll be coming up shortly. If you look in pasuk, in box number 6, taken from Yeshaya, Parak Nun Hey, chapter 55, Tachat Hanatzut Yalev Rosh, the Tachat HaSirpad Yaleh Hadas. So instead of the briar, a cypress shall rise. Instead of the nettle, a myrtle shall rise. And the Gemara wants to know in box number 7, what does it mean, Tachat HaSirpad? That instead of the sirpad, that something else is going, that a hadas is going to rise. So this is an allusion. This means that we're talking about Vashti HaRasha. Why was she such a wicked woman? Bat beno shel Nebuchadnezzar HaRasha. Who was she that was so significant? She was the daughter of the son of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, and as Kedichtiv, as it says, who burned the ceiling, Saraf, Refidat, same notion of, again, Sirpad of the house. And who is the Ya'aleh Hadas? I forgot to include this in English. Who is Ya'aleh Hadas? Zo Esther Hatzadeket Shenikra Hadassa. Esther is called Hadassah, and Hadas is going to take the place of the Sirpad. And the Sirpad is a play on words that refers to that perhaps Vashti was in fact the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who was pretty wicked, as we said before, who created this great exile of the Jewish people. And so with that in mind, so if Vashti perhaps is a grandchild of Nebuchadnezzar, if perhaps Achashverosh is living at this time, this starts to give us a better sense of their relationship and perhaps her intentions and maybe even Achashverosh's intentions as well. The Malbim has, I think, like one of the best commentaries on the entire Megillah. It is well worth studying just that. We can have like a year-long class just on that, quite honestly. And the Malbim sees the entire Megillah really as a treatise on political intrigue. There's this big debate in the Megillah about whether or not Achashverosh himself is like, a dummy, where he's just not the smartest or sharpest tool in the shed, or whether he's incredibly calculating and wise and deft and smart. There's this like balance between these two ideas. And what the Malbim tells us here is that not only was he intelligent, but he was so dangerous with his ability to be so conniving and so manipulative. When we think about like kings, there's different types of kings or monarchs, right? We got the Queen of England, right? She's not exactly like a tyrant, but then you've got others who really are more like tyrants than just who wield like real power instead of just people who sit in the throne. And if you look carefully what the Malbim says, and you can follow the Malbim's words throughout the Psukim, you'll see that Achashverosh is very, very careful and very smart about what it is that he's trying to do. So let's read it in the English. It just reads a little faster and a little better. So now it reports how immediately at the start of his reign, he grabbed hold to such an extent his heart led him to alter the throne, which had been in Babylon, moving it to Shushan and making Shushan the capital and royal city. So again, the Malbim is saying, if you look in these first psukim, what does it say? That it is by Yamim Ahim Keshevet Hamelach Achashverosh Al Kisei Malkuto. At the time when he was sitting in his chair. What does it mean, his chair? Normally, if you are trying to continue a tradition, if you will, what do? Nothing gives you greater joy than to sit in your father and grandfather and great-grandfather's chair who ruled for many years before you. But what does he do? He takes and makes a new chair and he relocates the kingdom to Shushan, right? And more than that, he does it to such an extent that he didn't fear that, thus he showed his strength, thinking immediately to reign without limits, to such an extent that he didn't fear that his subjects would rebel against him for changing the royal throne. And number two, his greatness and power. When a regular person becomes king, it's his honor to sit on the throne of past kings and not on a throne he makes for himself, which would actually reduce his honor. But he exalted himself so much that he established a new throne for himself. And it adds that he did not demonstrate this power after holding the throne for a long time, but immediately in those specific days. And here's the important part. His ultimate goal then was to show the nations and ministers. Why does he bring Vashi out? Because he's trying to show everyone that he did not marry her for her lineage, but for her beauty, since she was so beautiful. For if he had married her for her lineage, remember, she is the granddaughter of the great Nebuchadnezzar. And so this is like, prime stock. If you're trying to get up in the world, who are you going to marry? You want to marry a Vashti. And so what does he want to prove to everybody? I didn't marry her because she was Vashti. She means nothing to me. Who am I really? I am really the person who is great. And my power does not come from her. My power comes from me and my success and my conquerance. And so he focuses on her beauty and say, she was such a beautiful woman. In fact, I think in Persian, I can't remember where I saw this once, but in the Persian, the name Vashti actually means the most beautiful, right? It's just like a fascinating, like this is, in Persia, this is what's happening. So he wants to emphasize that through her royalty, it came to inherit the kingdom. He would not then show off her beauty, for whether beauty or ugly, he would have married her, since with her comes the kingdom. So this way, he reveals that he does not consider her a queen in her own right, and that he rules only because of himself, his strength, and his power. And so what we see here is that he's trying to establish himself. He takes her as his queen for beauty, not because she's an heiress to the throne. Notice carefully in those first psukim that Vashti's title changes a few times. Look in Pasuk Yud Aleph. How is she referred to in verse 11? Vashti HaMalka. Look in Pasuk Yud Bet. In Pasuk Yud Bet, what does it say over here? Vatima'in HaMalka Vashti. So we see here that there is a difference in the way that she's being referred. Is the fact that she is being commanded in verse 11, she's being commanded to bring Vashti HaMalka, Vashti. She's just, and she, by the way, happens to also be the queen. But when she responds, Hamalka Vashti, she's saying, no, I'm the queen. I'm not chopped liver here. I'm the queen. You married me for lineage here. And so one possibility in trying to understand Vashti's refusal and this entire story here is that this is all about Achashverosh's ability trying to push other people down to pick himself up. This is not a story of drunkenness. This is a story of a calculated tyrant. And in a sense, we can look at Vashti almost like a feminist hero, right? Vashti refuses to debase herself to this man, and even at all consequences, even if it could mean death or exile or excommunication or whatever it does happen to Vashti. So I think that's one way to read it. And on a similar vein, if we look at it in that regard, and I think, by the way, more and more in the last, number of years, many want to see Vashti in this way. I think we can also read it using the same piece of information slightly differently. Again, I'm not saying one is a better reading than the other, but if you look here, take a look in box number 9. I lost my place. Box number 9, the Megillah, Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet. So he was very enraged, right? So what does this mean here? Why did her refusal so incite him? Like, what was it about her saying no that made him so angry? So Rava teaches us here, Amarava shalcha le bar ahur rei da Abba. Abba lakaba alfa chamer shakti v'lo Rava. My father drank equivalent of 1,000. This is a reference to a pasuk in Daniel. My father you've been drinking for a few days? You're a stable boy. You're nothing, Vashti says. In other words, Vashti perhaps lorded herself over her husband because she was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And so their relationship is really very complex. If you look in even the Medrash Panim Acherim in box number 10, Kivan Shabau Asarisim Etzla, once these Sarisim came to her, Amrullah Kach Amar Melch, they said, this is the king said to do. Amra Lahem, she says to them, Amru lo shoteti peishim bi'anachai yitzei b'livcha. Are you insane? Are you a fool? Do you think this is going to happen? Do you know who I am? Ani Vashti Amalka. I'm Vashti. Bito shel Belshazzar b'not shel Nebuchadnezzar. I'm no slouch. I have royal lineage. Who was not only who was praised by kings and who's present, noble and melted. Right? You're going to tell me what to do? And so I think there's another possibility here, which is that it's almost like the reverse. In the first example, when we talk about Achashverosh and Vashti's lineage, as really helping us understand where they're coming from and their significance of their lives. One, Achashverosh perhaps is calculatingly, according to the Malbim, using his wife for political prowess. And the idea of bringing her naked in front of everybody else is as if to say, she's so beautiful that I only married her for her beauty. On the other hand, when we look at it from Vashti's perspective, Vashti perhaps is lording over her husband, and that is also not something that's going to be well received. In fact, like there's a well-known idea that if you want to save a relationship in any which way, there's like one character trait. There's one emotion that makes it almost unsalvageable when you have when you're trying to do like marriage counseling. I think John Gottman writes about this in his famous books, which is disdain. When you have disdain for your spouse, it's very hard to overcome that and to salvage the relationship. In a sense, Vashti perhaps had a lot of disdain for Achashverosh riding on her coattails, not giving her enough respect, or whatever it might be. And in fact, if you look through these psukim, I think you see a lot of these different things. There's a power imbalance. Why does Achashverosh send diplomats and advisors instead of coming to him herself? Because Vashti is the real queen, right? So he even can't come approach the great Vashti. So I think we see some of this here. Two other quick possibilities as we try to understand. I want to shift gears a little bit and focus on the notion that perhaps Achashverosh and Vashti really had a wonderful relationship. There was no disdain. There was no calculating moves trying to use each other for their own power or political gains. Rather, Vashti herself was extremely, extremely wicked. Take a look here in the Gemara Megillah. See, the problem that I've always had with the entire story of Vashti is that if Vashti was just a side character, why would God allow this to happen to her? Why would God allow her to be danced around in this way? Why would God allow any of these types of things to happen to her in this way? To be embarrassed in front of the entire kingdom in this way, and then to be thrown out? Like, what did she do to deserve it? And the rabbis try to figure this out. Chazal in the Gemara Megillah, which is just like a little bit above the last piece of Gemara Megillah that we saw, tries to fill in the gaps. And the Gemara tells us, I'm going to say a little bit outside, is that she also makes a Suda, and they both had sinful intentions, both Achashverosh and Vashti. And so what happened is that she was invited to come naked, because what were their goals? They both, it was like a giant like orgy. Everybody wanted just to be sleeping with everybody else. But here's what's interesting. Vashti here is being punished. Shebemidah shadam modeh. This is the third paragraph. In the way that a person acts, God punishes them. Midah keneged midah, an act for an act. So Melamed Shaita Vashti Arsha Neviah Benot Yisrael Mashtitatan Arumot Voseh Bahen Malacha B'Shabbat. What is it that Vashti used to do that made it midah keneged midah, an eye for an eye? She used to take Jewish women who were working for her and prance them around naked, and she would do it on Shabbat. What might be like a hint that it happened on Shabbat? Well, when did this happen? This whole thing in Pasuk Yud, Bayom HaShavi'i. Why do we care that this entire action happened on the seventh day in verse 10? Right? In the seventh day, meaning what's the seventh day? On Shabbat. Come the seventh day, all this happens. And so she used to hurt people on Shabbat and make them do terrible things on Shabbat. So she herself also gets punished in this way. And what's the other hint? In the first pasuk in Perek Bet, it talks about a gzeirah, it talks about a decree that happens on her. In the same way she decreed bad things to happen to the Jewish daughters, so too she had bad things happen to her as well. Now, you might want to say, if she was prepared she was excited, she was Achashverosh's partner, she was excited to come dressed in this way with just the crown and nothing else, and wearing no other clothes. So this is why now the Gemara kind of like invents the story, if you will, that suddenly she breaks out in leprosy, or maybe that God fashions her a tail, meaning why would she refuse? If she is Achashverosh's partner in every single way, why would she refuse? Well, she refuses because God does something to embarrass her, because as her punishment, midah keneged midah. And so therefore she now says no, which only brings upon the wrath of Achashverosh, because he feels like his partner has left him, in fact, hanging. And in fact, we can see this in other places as well. In box number 12, Esther Rabbah tells us that who was the real master behind the entire story? Not like the Malbim says, but it was actually Vashti herself. She was the true villainess of the entire story. V'lama alta lakach. Why did this happen to her? Because she never gave Achashverosh permission to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. If she in fact is the grandchild of Nebuchadnezzar, she would not want that to be rebuilt. So she was the impetus, she was the problem, she was the roadblock, if you will, that prevented Achashverosh and ultimately the Jewish people from having the temple be rebuilt. And in that sense, Vashti is truly a villain of the story. And in order for the story to move forward, we have to remove the villain, right? Before we can start to move forward and turn Achashverosh's heart. Achashverosh and Vashti are both villains. They're both people who didn't want the Beis Hamikdash to be rebuilt. So Vashti plays a crucial role up here on the very front end. The last thought that I want to share with you before we just conclude here is just maybe like a third or fourth way that we would look at this, which is that Vashti, I think perhaps is maybe just tragically misunderstood, and in a sense is just the victim of Achashverosh. Why does she refuse to go to the party? She refuses because she's trying to protect maybe her own modesty, or instead of her own modesty, maybe her own husband. You can see in box 13 and box 14, you can see both of these ideas here, that she was really looking out for his own well-being, realizing that her husband had maybe one too many drinks, and she's not the wicked person that we might think she is. She's actually a cunning and smart woman who does nothing more than wants to help her husband, which might help us better understand Achashverosh's reaction in the beginning of Perek Bet in chapter 2, when he realizes that his right-hand woman, who was actually, all she was doing was trying to look out for her own modesty. And this is what the Ralbag says, and you can see this similar in the Esther Rabbah in box 14. And I think there's this in box 15, we're not going to have time to read through it, but you can look here in box 15 to just see again, that she wanted nothing more than to help everybody. I do want to point out that, in a sense, Achashverosh, not only does he lose his wife, but he also really loses his entire life as well. There's this notion of not just keeping our private affairs private, but keeping family relationships private instead of keeping them public. And so what I think might be happening here is that by taking this marital spat and turning it into a matter of state, and by involving his advisors, ultimately Achashverosh throughout the story, after this point, he seems like a very weak man, right? He can't sleep. He needs support and help. People are trying to overthrow him. Bigtan and Teresh try to kill him. He doesn't know. He made promises to Haman. He's easily manipulated by Haman. He doesn't seem like the strong character that we see here in chapter 1, where in Perek Aleph, he's throwing big parties. He is the great Achashverosh who moves his kingdom to Shushan. And so in a sense, not only does he lose his life, but he also loses, not only does he lose his wife, but he also loses his life because he becomes just a big joke and nobody really takes him seriously. And so what I think emerges from here are 3 or 4 different ways for us to look at Vashti. One is that Vashti is a tool to Achashverosh's ambition, and her life is really just a prop for his own political gain. That's one possibility. The second is that maybe Vashti was a little bit stubborn and asserted her own status over her husband, and that ultimately leads to her downfall because she would lord it over her husband literally. The third idea we saw was that Vashti was in fact perhaps a truly wicked woman and was deserving of their fate because she supported Achashverosh's attempts not to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And the last thing we just mentioned quickly was that Vashti maybe was a tragic figure trying to save the grace of her husband from his own mistakes and his own drunken stupor. And so I want to conclude just with this last source here in box 16. I don't think that I agree with this assessment by Dr. Tamar Kadari. It's a really interesting article about the role that Midrash and Agada play in the Megillah, and in particular, how it plays a role in describing Vashti's life. Because you'll notice that there's, like we said at the very beginning, there's like a lot of blanks that we need to fill in. And the Midrash, like rabbinic literature, tries to fill it in. The Gemara tries to fill it in. But she points out that there's actually a difference in approach between that which was written in Bavel and that which was written in the land of Israel. If you can imagine, if you're living in Babylonia and you were writing at this time, or you're writing about this story or these stories, so it would make sense for you not to exactly see people like Nebuchadnezzar or maybe his grandchildren as being people that we want to support. You would have a pretty negative view of Vashti. On the other hand, in the Midrash, which is written in Eretz Yisrael, there's a more positive view. I just don't see that as necessarily making a lot of sense. So I'll read it to you here. This collection of Midrashim presents Vashi in a very negative light. The adverse attitude of the rabbis in Babylonia to Vashti might possibly have resulted from the fact that Vashti was Babylonian. And for the rabbis, she presented the local Babylonian women who were promiscuous and Jew haters, and emphasizing their negative traits probably aided in erecting barriers between Jews living in Babylonia and the local Gentile women. Again, I don't think that this is necessarily 100% accurate. I'm not convinced, because I think we do find Midrashim that portray Vashti as being quite immoral, not just all positive. I shared a few of those with you as well. But I do think it's something to point out. But no matter how we kind of take it, I do think that this idea of seeing Vashti as being wicked or maybe even deserving or being involved in her own fate, like she was deserving of what happened to her, or for creating this disdain for her husband, I think it actually serves a much more significant and important point for all of this, which is that we don't feel too bad for her. Meaning the commentaries are trying to fill in the gaps so we don't feel bad for Vashti. How many people dress up as Vashti on Purim? I don't know anybody dressed up as Vashti. It's Queen Esther. Maybe they do. I shouldn't say that. If you once dressed up as Vashti, I meant you no insult. But no one, Vashti, no one sees her in this way. We see her as someone that perhaps we shouldn't maybe feel so badly for. And I think this idea, this image of Vashti as like this Jew-hating woman who justifies, in a sense, it justifies her own replacement by none other than Esther. And had she not gone through with this, had we not been able to paint her as deserving of her fate, then we would have a lot of guilt when we read the story. We'd feel really bad about it. And in that sense, her role maybe serves like a literary goal, which is not only does it make the reader feel a little bit better about themselves, but it helps move the story forward. For if we were feeling bad for Vashti, then when we looked at Esther's great rise to power, in the back of our heads, we would say, yeah, but what about poor Vashti? Yeah, that's nice for Esther, but Esther, maybe help out your sister Vashti over here. But by portraying her in any of these ways as either being disdainful and therefore deserving in some way, or just being a political pawn, whatever it might be, or just simply being wicked, it makes the story a lot easier to swallow and a lot easier to tell. And in that sense, I think it really makes Vashti a great supporting actor, because that's what supporting actors do. They help the main characters look their best. And so I think there's a lot more to unpack about Vashti. The psukim, I think, are very, very unclear. And I'll be happy over Shabbat or next time we see each other in person, or for those who are here, you want to stick around and schmooze in person, be happy to continue the conversation. So with that, we'll stop here. We'll pick up next Wednesday night. Next Wednesday night, we'll be talking about Zeresh, another wife. This time, Zeresh is the wife of Haman. We'll talk about her and her role in the story and supporting Haman. And join us again, 8 o'clock, same time, same place, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening and a Chodesh Tov and a happy Purim. Chag Purim Sameach.